Well, to begin with, I'm biased because I'm a supporter of the Obama administration. And so my views obviously reflect that. At the same time, I think I can give a pretty fair assessment of their experience thus far. First and foremost, it's important to realize that the Obama administration policy towards North Korea did not evolve in a vacuum. It's really much more of a continuum from the policies of three different preceding administrations, and in some ways a product of a lot of water under the bridge. Over the last 2 decades now, we've had a series of fundamental challenges in dealing with North Korea, and there has been a series of North Korean actions and statements which have gradually constrained the policy options available on North Korea. So if you look at the beginning of the Obama administration, or more particularly the campaign period, they were very clear about their broad belief in the power of and the importance of diplomacy and their willingness to engage North Korea. Diplomacy was not viewed as a reward. It was viewed as a tool for American interests. And so there was a willingness to engage North Korea. President Obama famously and repeatedly during the course of the campaign referred to his willingness to kind of extend a hand if countries like North Korea would be willing to unclench their fist. Obviously, that did not work out too well. In the very early months of the Obama administration, North Korea unwisely decided to proceed with the test of a long-range missile, and then decided to proceed with a second nuclear test. And really, it was those two early events that really set the cast of the Obama administration policy. My own personal view, I mean, you can talk about strategic patience. There's a couple of different ways I would like to characterize it. In some ways, I think it was a bit of a reaction to the excesses of the two different phases of the Bush administration policy towards North Korea. If you look at the first term of George W. Bush, that policy was really defined by a disdain for diplomacy. This was the Dick Cheney era of, we don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it, and a concerted effort to kind of undermine diplomatic approaches towards North Korea. And that was replaced in turn, following the first test of a nuclear weapon by North Korea, by an approach under Christopher Hill that in some respects went too far the other direction. An effort to keep a process going for a process's sake, and which unfortunately, in my mind at least, had its priorities wrong. It was really an effort where you engaged North Korea first and foremost, and then based on the results of these kind of secret meetings with North Korea, went and briefed China and got them on board, and then lastly came and went back to our allies in South Korea and kind of tried to get them on board. And I think the Obama administration in many respects reacted to both. They reacted to the excesses of the Bush administration by repeatedly stating their willingness to engage in their belief in the process and utility of and the importance of diplomacy. But at the same time, they reacted to the excesses of the second term of the Bush administration by focusing on the importance of working with their allies first and foremost. And so you will see both during the campaign and the early months and years of the Obama administration a priority being placed on first and foremost strengthening our alliance relationships with South Korea and Japan, and based on that strong coordination with allies, moving to another phase of bringing the Chinese and the Russians on board, and then based on a concerted kind of regional approach, then approaching North Korea. So the priorities were there, the orders were there. And in some respects, I think you can say that policy was very successful. I mean, we've heard a mantra, which is a bit of a dangerous mantra, but a mantra for the last year now about U.S.-ROK relations being the best ever. And part of that's born of a concerted decision in Washington to make sure that first and foremost the U.S. was on the same page as its ally South Korea in approaching North Korea. So there has been incredible policy coordination with both Washington and Seoul and Washington and Tokyo over the last 4 years. And I think that has characterized the approach. I would, in a different way of looking at it, argue maybe a little bit controversially that the Obama administration really doesn't have a North Korea policy. They've made it clear from the very beginning that America's national interests don't necessarily lie first and foremost in improving relations with North Korea. In other words, our national interest is the peace, prosperity, and economic progress of East Asia. That's where our interests lie. They lie in our alliances with South Korea and Japan. They lie in our partnership and working with China and with Russia, and in making sure that no matter what North Korea does, whether it reforms or collapses or lashes out or starts a conflict, that it doesn't become a broader regional confrontation, that it doesn't impact on our core interests in the region. And so the reason I characterize it that way is that there have been many times in the past when we have become so fixated on the relationship with North Korea that it's become an end in and of itself. What do we need to do to improve relations with North Korea? Well, improving relations with North Korea is not the priority. North Korea is, in my perspective, the hole in the Northeast Asian donut. It's a relatively small, economically insignificant country that we pay attention to only because it has the capacity to threaten our real strategic interests in the region. So that's what our interest is making sure that North Korea does not threaten our real economic, security, and other strategic interests in the region. And so in that regard, I think you could argue that rather than having a North Korea policy, the Obama administration has really had a Northeast Asia policy. And I think it's been a very successful one, particularly in that context, where fortunately, despite some very difficult years, if you think 2009 missile test, nuclear test, 2010 sinking of the Cheonan, shelling of Yeonpyeong Island, 2012, again another missile test, and who knows where we go from here. In late 2010, the deathing of Kim Jong-il. These are all very volatile, difficult issues, which yet, importantly, and I think notably, have not become major issues of division in the region, particularly between our allies, but even with China in some difficult times, some very, very difficult times. Finally, again, strategic patience is often referred to as kind of a strategy, but it's really not a strategy. I mean, it's really more descriptive than it is kind of a policy, if you will. Really, it's a recognition that we're not able to move forward until North Korea is able to move forward. And rather than use the term strategic patience, I think the president himself described it very well in October of 2010 when he was giving a joint press conference with President Lee Myung-bak, and he was asked about the prospects for returning to the six-party talks, the multilateral negotiations for engaging North Korea in the nuclear issue. And he responded, I think quite presciently, that the process of getting back to the six-party talks was very difficult, would require a tremendous investment of time and energy and political capital, and that before we were willing to do that, we would have to see some indication of seriousness of purpose from North Korea, that there's a prospect for moving forward. And so, if you look at the nascent kind of diplomatic efforts in late 2011. Which culminated in the February 29th Leap Day deal with North Korea. That deal really was structured specifically to be a test of North Korean intent, a test of North Koreans' capacity to move forward, a test of North Korea's seriousness of purpose. And I would add, it's a test that North Korea has apparently, at least for now, failed. A lot of the media and expert commentaries since the North Korean satellite launch, missile launch of April, have indicated that because this is an election year, the Obama administration is not likely to engage North Korea again. And I would posit, and in the broader context of the policy I just laid out, that even if it was not an election year, even if this was 2013 or 2011, you would find little appetite in Washington on a bipartisan basis for engaging North Korea. Because of their clear indication, again, either of their lack of willingness or lack of capacity at this point to move forward in a serious way, in such a way that would be sufficient for us to return to the negotiating table. So we, rather than having strategic patience, it's really much more of a descriptive element of where we are right now. I don't like describing strategic places as a strategy. It's not a strategy. It's just a description of the reality. And the reality is that in the current political environment and all the other countries combined, there is not an option of us being more proactive because, one, there's no evidence that North Korea is prepared to engage, and you certainly wouldn't want to expend your time, energy, and political capital if there's no prospect for success. There are many other problems in the world, and so you just wait. You just wait till there's a change in North Korea, and that's where we're at right now. That change can take many forms. Positively, if there was some indication that Kim Jong-un decides that he wants to be an open reformer and he's got full control over the military and he's ready to move forward, that would be great. So far, it seems to me that as a 29-year-old man, he can't even choose his wardrobe. So if he's stuck wearing his grandpa's suit and hat, he may not be able to kind of abandon this now constitutionally enshrined nuclear weapons program. So I have low expectations on that front. But probably a more likely scenario, but a more dangerous scenario, is that North Korea will continue to try to test long-range missiles. They will continue to try to test nuclear weapons. And thus far, North Korea has been successful not by any effort of their own, but just by world circumstances, of always being kind of a number 2 or number 3 priority security problem for the U.S., but now never number 1. And one of the real important challenges we face is understanding what the consequences would be if North Korea were to have an unambiguously successful nuclear test or an unambiguously successful long-range missile test. Because that would change the political dynamic in Seoul, and that would change the political dynamic in Washington. Because we can kind of laugh and make fun of failed missile tests and failed nuclear tests, but if they're unambiguously successful, that would bring a new level of pressure to the issue that would force it, and not necessarily in a good way. On the one hand, I can understand the frustration with, again, strategic patience, because you're saying, things are just going to get worse. Why don't we try to do something more proactively? But you've got this old doctor's Hippocratic oath. And the first law is do no harm, and so you had to be able to make the case that by doing something, that you were going to make the situation better, or at least not worse. And at this point, when North Korea continues to assert that it is a nuclear power, when it continues to want to negotiate as a nuclear power and seek legitimacy for its nuclear status, how do you go about negotiating with them without supporting that assertion, without recognizing them as a nuclear power, without rewarding them for bad behavior, and without undermining your broader global and regional standards? That's the challenge. That's the hard part. And so the old slogan of "don't just sit there, do something" is kind of inverse. You don't do something, you just sit there, right? In other words, you don't do something just for the sake of doing something. You do something if there's a clear strategy that it has a prospect of success. And before you're going to do that, you want a clear indication of seriousness of purpose of North Korea. So again, the Obama administration isn't just sitting around doing nothing. If you look at 2011, there was a series of very active negotiations, culminating in the Leap Day deal, the February 29th deal. But again, they were structured in such a way that the intent was to test North Korea, to gauge whether or not this is something we should go forward with, and that failed. We've had this discussion now for 20 years, and this is why I'm talking about water under the bridge. So you really can't just kind of say, okay, let's wipe the slate clean, let's give North Korea inducements, rewards, and consequences. Because the truth is, your rewards, your carrots are no longer on the table. Because at this point, North Korea has tested a nuclear weapon. There are 3 different sets of UN Security Council sanctions resolutions on North Korea, which they have not complied for, which remain in full force, right? There are 2 different UN Security Council presidential statements, which remain in full force, right? So the inducements angle, right? That part of your toolbox really is off the table in the short run. Most recently, the U.S. Congress, right, passed an amendment to the Farm Bill, which outlaws food aid to North Korea. Mercifully, it provided a presidential waiver, but that's not on your table anymore. Again, that was always a very uncomfortable and perhaps politically inappropriate linkage of humanitarian aid in politics anyway. But if you're a negotiator as North Korean, you have so few tools, it was almost an impossible thing to resist in that process. But they're not there. So again, we can talk about carrots and sticks, but the reality is there are no carrots at this point. The only way you can get carrots is North Korea is going to have to begin to set the environment in such a way that we can begin to discuss carrots. But at this point, we can't even talk about them until they're willing to come back. That's just a reality. It's a historical reality. Those actions have taken place. You cannot undo the Cheonan. You cannot undo the Yeonpyeong-do shelling. You cannot undo the shooting of a tourist at Kumgangsan, right? And so as a result, these issues are now standing forth as obstacles to moving forward, and there needs to be some movement on North Korea's side, to kind of address those before we can go forward. That is the indication of seriousness of purpose. So absent that, what we do is we continue to work together. We continue to ensure that we have a unified position between the United States and South Korea as an ally, and that we make sure that that position is coordinated closely with Japan, as we did just earlier this month in the trilateral meeting between Secretary Clinton, Foreign Minister Gemba, and Foreign Minister Kim Sung-hwan. And then we based on that, try to coordinate our position closely with the Chinese and the Russians and the rest of the world. That's how you set the environment. But I do kind of reject the notion that somehow, okay, everything has failed for 20 years, let's just start all over. Because, again, there's a lot of water under the bridge. You cannot undo a nuclear test. You cannot pretend that North Korea has not proclaimed itself as a nuclear power. Those things enabled, the October, 21st, 1994 Geneva Agreed Framework. That environment does not exist anymore. The environment of the September 19, 2005 joint statement does not necessarily exist anymore. So we're in a different era, and we've got to deal with the cards that have been played to us. And so when again, I agree we ought to try to shape the environment, and it's important for the U.S., as it has, to continue to state that we have no hostile intent, that we're willing to engage with them. And again, I think that's what the February 29th deal was. I mean, it wasn't exactly a hardline deal, right? But in the end, North Korea's got to deal with their own internal problems first until we can engage in that point. Mercifully, the questions of Korea and Korea policy and even North Korea policy have not been particularly partisan issues. This was true in 2008. There was not a tremendous distance between what was the McCain camp policy and the Obama team policy at that time. And I do not anticipate that there will be significant differences between a Romney campaign or an Obama re-election campaign on Korea policy writ large. So far, even in Asia more broadly, the closest you've come to distinguishing differences, Romney as a candidate's repeated pledge to on day one designate China as a foreign currency manipulator, which is fine, except for so far the campaign has yet to talk about what they would do on day two, when the Chinese begin to respond. But more broadly, I think, one, the Obama campaign deserves a lot of credit in 2008 for not politicizing the policy, including China. I mean, they really broke with a lot of past history. When you compare, the Clinton campaign from 1992, talking about Bush having coddled dictators and the butchers of Beijing, and you think to Bush in 2000 talking about strategic competitors with China. The 2008 campaign was a very mature campaign on foreign policy issues, and I anticipate that the 2012 campaign, at least in regards to Asia, will again be a relatively mature, non-controversial campaign. This election, I think, will be decided primarily on domestic economic issues, not on foreign policy. But part of the reason for that is, I think, Asia policy has really been a strong suit for the Obama administration. There's not a lot of grist for the mill, not a lot of area for controversy. If you look at 2011 alone, between the passage of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, between the East Asia Summit, the successful hosting of the APEC Summit in Honolulu, the U.S. kind of active role in Asia, the rebalancing, or what people call the pivot towards Asia, our close coordination with South Korea in the response to the horrible events of 2010, and our efforts on North Korea. Again, there's I think, broad bipartisan agreement, the importance of the alliance, the importance of the region, our commitment to the region. There have been a few statements from the Romney campaign kind of gratuitously criticizing the Leap Day deal, as being appeasement of North Korea. But the reality was the Obama administration has repeatedly made clear their intention to break out of the cycle of paying for talks with North Korea, rewarding bad behavior, buying the same horse 6, 7, 8 times, however you want to describe that same cycle. And whether or not you supported the effort or the nascent attempt to engage North Korea or not, it's very difficult to claim that the Obama administration gave any compensation, because in the end the deal fell apart. The North Koreans violated the deal before the ink had dried. There was no food aid given. There was no aid or assistance given. And so you could make the case that that cycle really has been broken. In fact, I would argue that during the 4 years of the Obama administration, again, in addition to economic aid or assistance or any type of kind of what would you consider to be inducements, the Obama administration has implemented more meaningful sanctions on North Korea than ever in history. Not perfect. The problem's not over. The problem remains. But in terms of kind of forging an international coalition to work to help clarify North Korea's choice and to help break out of that cycle of rewarding bad behavior, I think there's been some progress in that regard. But again, back to the broader question, in terms of the elections, I don't anticipate, and I certainly hope that this will continue to be a nonpartisan issue. If you kind of walk down the other elections, I've just discussed the campaigns in the United States. I do not anticipate dramatically different policies from the United States, regardless of the outcomes of the elections, mainly because our policy options are greatly constrained. South Korea holds probably the promise for the greatest potential change in policy, but even then, South Korea of 2012 is very different than South Korea of 2007 or 2006. So even if you were to have a progressive administration elected in Seoul, there remain, in my mind, deep questions about North Korea's capacity to respond to a South Korean overture, and I think a pretty high likelihood that whether it is a Park Geun-hye or a Saenuri당, a conservative party attempting an initial outreach to North Korea, or a progressive party, be it Moon Jae-in or An Cheol-soo or Kim Do-kwon or whoever it may be, if they try to reach out to North Korea, my guess is that the real question really is North Korea right now ready? Are they capable of responding to what is a very difficult situation? Because the truth is, South Korean expectations of engagement with North Korea are different today than they were in 2007. The notion that even a progressive government in South Korea could provide unconditional support to North Korea with no strings attached at all is inconceivable, right? And certainly in the current climate, after the Cheonan, after the sinking of Yenpyeong, etc. So South Korea again may bring the large change of approach, but I'm not sure that fundamentally alters the prospects of returning to the six-party talks, because the one thing that North Korea has not been willing to engage with South Korea on is serious security issues. They're basically only willing to engage with South Korea in discussions of how much South Korea can give it in terms of aid and money, etc. Right? Then you move on to China, leadership change. I've actually heard recent rumors that suggest that one reason the Chinese have not been focusing on even the term six-party talks is that they too are facing leadership change, and that the six-party talks is seen as kind of a legacy issue for Hu Jintao, not necessarily for Xi Jinping. That's really rumors. I don't know how to prove that one way or the other. We'll see what type of a message comes out and whether or not Xi Jinping wants to kind of pick up that prospect and kind of move forward with it, but I'm a bit doubtful. Russia had a leadership change probably most early on, but again, a leadership change from Putin back to Medvedev, from Medvedev back to Putin, so change in faces, not really change in policies. I don't anticipate that as impacting the six-party talks process. And Japan, again, I don't think you can see any difference in Korea policy depending on whether it's Noda or anybody else at this point. So in the end, what was anticipated to be a year of tremendous change in 2012 in terms of politics turns out to be one that doesn't have a lot of change in the status quo, at least impacting the six-party talks.